All right, let's get going. Reminder, next week's lab is outside. If you can drive, and take students, take your classmates, that would be appreciated. We are going to be driving to the Red Arroyo. It's not terribly far. Yep. Yep, we'll have a map. We'll show the map. Yeah, it's a pretty easy place, but we'll go out there. As a reminder, you will give your lab instructor your data that you collect, because we pool the data for the next week. So we have to have everyone's data from next week for the week after, and then I'll get that posted on Blackboard. The exams are just about done. You'll get them on Friday. So if you want them, make sure you show up here. All right, any questions? This is where we left off as a quick review. All right, so we're talking about water balance in plants. And we really have a problem. The plants have a problem that they have to address. Right? You have some plants that live in hot and dry conditions. Right? They're trying to conserve water because those hot and dry conditions are causing evaporation, water loss in those plants, and they don't want that, so they try to conserve it. Their response is to close the stomata to limit how much transpiration actually happens. But if the stomata are closed, then you can't have gas exchange, and you can't have this continuous supply of CO2 coming into the plant. All right, so how does the plant respond? Well, the plant can respond by altering its metabolic pathways, or evolving a different metabolic pathway that separates where we have carbon fixation and carbon assimilation. So to kind of introduce those adaptations, we had to start with the most common type of pathway, which is the C3 pathway. So the C3 cycle is the Calvin cycle. It's just a Calvin cycle. CO2 is captured from the air, fixed and assimilated in one step. That enzymatic step utilizes Rubisco to combine RUBP with CO2 to produce 2,3 carbon molecules. That gets that carbon into the plant and along its way to produce a sugar. All right. The downside of this is that Rubisco doesn't really have a very high affinity for CO2. So as the stomata close and gas exchange stops, Rubisco will proceed until the concentration of CO2 falls below that compensation point. Once it falls below the compensation point, then Rubisco will have a tendency to bind to oxygen. And when that does, in a process called photorespiration, the plant starts to consume even more energy because it has to regenerate even more compounds to try to get this cycle going. And it can't get it going until CO2 rises above that compensation point again. So one way to address that issue is to separate where we have fixation and assimilation. And C4 plants do it by separating it in space. So I have this type of specific anatomy where all our chloroplasts are concentrated around the bundle sheath cells. That's where your Calvin cycle is going to occur. That's where your Rubisco is going to occur. But that's not where fixation happens. Fixation is going to be happening in the plant leaf itself. And that first step is going to use PEP carboxylase. So PEP C has a high affinity. It's going to pull out basically as much CO2 in that leaf as it can. And in so doing, it's going to ensure that we have a very high concentration of CO2 right at Rubisco. So as long as we maintain a high concentration of CO2, we prevent photorespiration from occurring in those types of plants. All right, so we have PEP carboxylase catalyzing our reaction, our fixation steps, gets it to malate, which then shuttles it into the bundle sheaths, where malate then releases the CO2 back to rubisco and proceeds with our assimilation steps. All right? Now, we've added one more step. We've added one more cycle in these plants. So when we add this cycle, it's going to cost us even more energy. Why? It's because we're not only regenerating the RUBP from the Calvin cycle, we also have to regenerate PEP, and we have the energy to transport malate into the bundle sheaths. So we've got a higher energy expenditure, which results in a lower efficiency, but we avoid photorespiration. Cam plants separate our fixation and assimilation in time. So C4 was in space, cam plants are all in time. So they're going to go ahead and fix CO2 at night. While the stomata are open, they're going to be taking CO2 out of the air, fixing it as malate. It gets stored in the vacuoles as malic acid, where it just keeps building up. And then, once we transition to the day, stomata are going to close, gas exchange stops, temperatures rise, and now we have this transition where the malic acid now transforms back to malate, gets released from the vacuoles, and now dumps its CO2 right to rubisco to maintain that high concentration there. All right? We have the same two pathways. Go back here. Same two pathways as we do C4. So we have that same energy requirement, but now we've added an even more energy expensive process, which is regulation. How do we regulate? How do we keep the plant from taking the fixation and assimilation, or doing those two things at the same time? This is where our regulatory steps come into play. We have to maintain that. That's even more energy expenditure, which makes the cam plants even less efficient. So, I don't think I did I think I did do the compensation point graph, but just as a review, we have our concentration of CO2. We have our oxygen generation. Here's our 0 point. C3s. Something like that. C4s. Our cam plants. Way down there. So let me enlarge this. All the viewers at home can see it. Oops. Right? So compensation point higher at C3. We have photorespiration down here. We've got photosynthesis, energy production up here. Compensation point for the C4 and the cam plants, much lower than our C3 plants, but comes at a cost. When we have abundant CO2, C3 plants are always going to outcompete C4 and cam plant because we don't have as many energy expenditures in those C3 plants. All right, so these cam plants, much less efficient, slower growth rates, fewer or less reproductive output, and so forth. All right, questions on those three pathways? All right, so C4, at least the C4 plants, seem like they'd be a pretty good balance between water conservation and production. So the question is, why don't we have more? Why don't we have more? And I don't know if I gave this. I didn't. Give a percentage? It didn't. We actually have a pretty small percentage of C4 plants out there. So why? Why not more? Well, there's a couple different reasons why C3 plants evolved to be favored. All right. One of them was the efficiency issue. All right. One of them is the efficiency issue. Both the C4 and CAM plants are less energy efficient compared to C3 when we have high concentrations of CO2. And we've had high concentrations of CO2 through Earth's history. We've had much higher concentrations of CO2. CO2 concentrations were very high when plants were evolving and diversified. So we were always up in this area. And when you're up in this area, it's going to have a hard time for these C4 and CAM plants to outcompete the C3 plants. So at the time when these plants were evolving and diversifying, yeah, we didn't really have to worry about photorespiration. You can get by with Rubisco. You can get by with that moderate affinity. Because the CO2 levels were already high, it was much less likely to ever approach that compensation point. So that's explanation number one. Explanation number two relates directly to those C4 plants. Because what we need to do with the C4 is we're fixing the CO2 out of the air into malate, and then we have to try to concentrate that in the bundle sheaths to ensure a high concentration right at Rubisco. And that's actually somewhat hard to do. And as we increase our CO2, it's even harder to get a high concentration in those bundle sheath cells. So again, higher concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere hit us with both the efficiency and the need to concentrate at those bundle sheaths, or in those bundle sheath cells. And the last thing is temperature related. So Rubisco binding oxygen doesn't really happen at our lower temperatures. How low? Well, it's not very low at all. Actually at or below 25 degrees Celsius. So a little bit warmer than room temperature. When we're at those temperatures or below, oxygen just doesn't really bind to Rubisco. So we don't have that same problem of photorespiration occurring. At our really hot temperatures, like desert-like environments, yeah, we've got that problem. But below that temperature, we don't really have the issue of photorespiration. So if we put these plants in a cooler location, let's say just go north, say 200 miles, everything above that 200-mile line, we're not going to be seeing temperatures regularly above 25 degrees Celsius. Yeah, we may see it for a week or two, or maybe 3 weeks, maybe 5 or 6, depends on the area. But most of the time, it's going to be this 25 degrees or less. So in all of those areas, and you have to think globally, all of those areas, if you don't have this photorespiration problem, you don't really have that need to try to evolve a mechanism to maintain photosynthesis at those lower concentrations. When you get to those lower concentrations, photosynthesis still works, and it's still going to work, and it's working because Rubisco won't be binding to Rubisco, or oxygen won't be binding to Rubisco. All right, so shaded environments. Those tend to be cooler. Gives the edge to C3 plants. Shaded environments also gives advantage to C3 plants because these guys, C4 and CAM, really need high light conditions to regenerate all of that ATP in those two cycles. So shaded is kind of like a double whammy. Lower temperatures and lower energy, or less energy from the light reactions. The other aspect is that Pepsi's optimum temperature is between 30 and 35 degrees. All right, if that's the optimum fixation temperature, you're not going to see it at these cooler locations. So these three things, the efficiency issue, the concentrating in the bundle sheaths, and optimum temperatures of our enzymes, really kind of play a part, or they all played a part in why we see so many more C3 plants relative to the C4 and the CAM plants. All right. So that was all about water stress. Too much water can also be a problem. All right. Why would it be a problem? It's because oxygen uptake typically occurs in the roots. Primarily occurs in the roots. Yeah, the plants produce oxygen, but they also have to take some oxygen in. So if you flood the soils, if you put too much water around those roots, plants won't be able to get oxygen. And if they can't get the oxygen, they can't utilize it in their pathways. All right, so how do the plants get around that? Two different adaptations. One is biochemical. All right, so with the biochemical, what we're saying is that the plants recognize that we're stressed for oxygen, and they just slow their metabolic rates. They slow their growth rates. They slow things down, and in doing so, they reduce their oxygen requirement. They're not entering, diapause. They're not developmentally arresting, but they are slowing their growth rates down drastically until conditions improve. So with the biochemical adaptation, some plants will do this, and that's to try to reduce their oxygen requirement. Other plants, especially those plants that regularly see these flooded conditions, have developed these secondary structures. These secondary structures came about specifically for oxygen uptake. All right, so the two structures that we see are adventitious roots and pneumatophores. So adventitious roots are those roots that are produced at or above the soil level, and their purpose is to absorb oxygen from the air. That's what they look like. We're above the soil. They spread out, go into the soil, but these are the sites where oxygen uptake will occur. Corn plants, they've got them. And you might say, well, corn isn't flooded fields. Yeah, you have to think about where did they evolve. They evolved. They lived in areas that did receive a lot of rain where the soils were flooded. Maybe not the whole year, but if they were flooded for a week or two and you stopped oxygen exchange, that's a bad thing for our plants. So these adventitious roots provide a way for the plant to get oxygen when soils are completely saturated. The second morphological adaptation are the pneumatophores. Mangroves have these. All right, so the pneumatophores are specialized root-like structures. Note, specialized root-like structures. They extend from the roots up above the surface of the soil, or in some cases, extend above the surface of the water. They also function in absorbing oxygen, getting oxygen from the air. There's much more oxygen in the air than in the water. So these pneumatophores have been called aerial roots because they extend up into the air. Questions? All right, so I believe this wraps up. Yep, this wraps up our physiological ecology part. All right, so the physiology could spend a lot more time talking about specific adaptations, variation in some of these adaptations, and so forth, but it's probably best to just move on and continue learning just that broad field of ecology. So I put together the summary slide to kind of summarize what we've covered in this part of the course. All right? So we recognize that adaptive responses exist. Our organisms face varying environments, various selection pressures, and adaptations have evolved to allow the organisms to survive. All right? Various types of adaptations evolved. Some of them were resting stages or inactive life forms. So these things are all aimed at avoiding the harsh conditions. All right? They shut themselves down, wait it out, wait for conditions to improve, and then start their activities again. Some of them prefer to move. Now we've got our local movement and we have our long distance movement. Those are responses to two different scales of the harsh conditions. But instead of becoming inactive, the organism just moves, tries to find a better place, and again, waits for conditions to improve so that they can return. And then you have the adaptations that change the tolerance limits. These are the adaptations that we typically think of. If we can produce these pneumatophores, all right, it shifts our tolerance range for the oxygen, because now, even if our roots see very low oxygen levels, we have a mechanism to acquire oxygen from the air. The variation in the environment is what dictates this, dictates what kind of adaptations we'll see. So if we know that type of variation, what's causing it, what's its frequency, is it predictable, is it not predictable? It helps us better understand all of the adaptations that we see out there. So, types of questions that we could ask is, okay, we see this adaptation. What factor was limiting? What factor produced that? What's a selective force to favor that adaptation? Was that selection force? Was it a constant type of selection force, meaning a harsh type of selection, or was it more variable, which made it much harder to evolve a mechanism? Was the variation predictable? Was it unpredictable? All right. Did we have some sort of interaction? So if we had low water conditions, was that also coupled with, let's say, high temperatures or high light? So are we going to see multiple adaptations evolving that might be correlated to one, but each one evolved in response to a different set of factors? And then also, that last part, is the organism mobile or sessile? So can it move to a new area, or is it stuck? Plants are stuck. They can't get up and move. So they have to deal with their conditions wherever they start growing. And we're going to be moving and talking about this variation and the nature of the variation. So this kind of gets to this point. You can have two different organisms, and they can have similar responses or adaptations that have evolved. And these things could evolve to different limiting factors, two different factors producing it, if the type of variation, if the nature of the variation is similar. So if they both are facing constant and predictable conditions, we might see similar responses, even though the selective force is slightly different. All right, and this is kind of like the take-home point here. All right, we see similar responses, we see similar adaptations. Some of these evolved multiple times, and they evolved in response to different factors, but the nature of that variation was usually similar. All right, questions? does it open up? Go back here. All right, for the quiz, I've got answers for you. 2 answers are correct today. I had to look them up, couldn't remember. Answer number 1 is 5. Answer number 2 is 7. So the 2 answers are 5 and 7. 5 and 7. The 2 prime numbers on that list. All right, 5 and 7. Give you a little bit more time. All right, that quiz over the water stress in plants goes live in 2 minutes, I believe. So at 8:30 it goes live. You have until Friday at the end of the day to take it. All right. Again, same rules. 3 attempts. Take it up to 3 times. Take the highest grade. Due date's Friday. There's a late penalty if you don't take it by Friday, but you still have a chance to retake it after the due date. But again, it's a late penalty. All right, we ready? So we are moving to environmental variation. This is really trying to better understand why we have this variation across the environment. You know, what causes it, and then we'll talk about some of the evolutionary theories pertaining to this variation. All right, so this environmental variation determines our species distributions. It determines where we find things, where we find species, where we don't find species, and so forth. And this variation varies in space, also varies in time. All right, but in terms of species distributions, we usually focus on that spatial variation. All right, so what causes that spatial variation? It's typically due to the discontinuities in physical and biological factors. All right. So here's just a overview. Let's see here, a satellite image. This is White Sands National Park. And I thought it represented a pretty good image of the spatial variation. Because we have desert, really dry desert here, and then you get up into the mountains where it's green. Where it's green, you have plants growing, you have trees growing there in the Lincoln National Forest. Some places you can get snow up on the mountaintops. All right, this is variation. This is environmental variation. That variation, that set of biotic and abiotic characteristics in the habitats is going to affect the ecology and the evolution of the organisms living there. It's going to influence the adaptations. The adaptations that evolve are going to change the interactions. That's going to produce different selection pressures on the rest of the organisms there, and so forth. It's a big cycle. All right? So what produces this variation? Right? Why do we get it? And the variation that we're going to focus on are the abiotic factors. I think some people write still. All right. So our abiotic factors determine our species range. All right, it's going to determine, I should say, our geographic range. As we'll learn, it's kind of determines our theoretical ranges because the abiotic factors basically tell us our zone of tolerance. Now, just because we're in our zone of tolerance doesn't mean we're going to find species there. We're going to find our population of interest. Because the population also has to deal with all the other organisms that are out there. All right? If their food source isn't there, they can't survive. All right? So our abiotic factors ultimately determine our geographic range of the species. And that geographic range is a region in which a particular species is found or could be found. Let's fix that. Is found. I thought I had already changed all of these, corrected them. Yeah, no, it meant, let's change it. If found, could be found. That's good. I did change it. It's the region in which a particular species could be found. Doesn't mean it is. All right, because that's where the biological factors come into play. So our species first has to be in its tolerance zone. All right, and that is determined by the abiotic factors, and then all of the other biological factors that go into our species presence absence has to tell us, or has to dictate, yeah, the species can survive here. All right, so climate is a key component of the physical environment. It's a key component of our abiotic factors because the climate tells us the temperatures and tells us the amount of precipitation that our organisms are going to encounter. So two major things. All right, so just kind of as a comparison, we've got a tropical forest and we have a desert. Tropical forest, look at the temperature. Temperature range is pretty stable. Doesn't fluctuate much. Our organism doesn't have to deal with a wide range in temperatures. Unlike the desert, where we've got high temperatures for part of the year, low temperatures in part of the year. We've got a much wider range of temperatures. So tropical forest sees relatively stable temperatures, but they also see variation in rain. They get a lot of precipitation, more during the wet season, less during the dry season, unlike the desert where we get virtually no rain. So these are two different environmental conditions, two different abiotic conditions, and only those organisms with their tolerance zone, with their tolerance range, suitable for a tropical forest or a desert, could potentially be found there. So we're going to start with temperature. All right? We're going to start with temperature and action. So temperature is largely determined by the amount of solar radiation. Hopefully this is all reviewed. So the more solar radiation you receive, the warmer it is. All right. Those at the equator, closer to the sun, hotter, it's going to be hotter. Closer to the poles, we're farther from the sun, we're going to be cooler. But we also have the angle, too. So we're at more of a right angle. So you hold your hand underneath a lamp like this, where it's flat, you're going to feel more heat than if you hold it at an angle. All right? In our atmosphere, this is actually more noticeable on the Earth because that light has to pass through a longer distance in the atmosphere, which makes it more likely that the solar radiation is going to be reflected and scattered and never really makes the surface. Never really makes the surface. All right, so as we increase in latitude, our temperatures get cooler. how much cooler also is affected by our altitude. All right, so the higher up you go, the higher up in altitude, the cooler your temperature. So go up a mountain, it's going to get colder. Why? It does so through a process called adiabatic cooling. All right. So a decrease in air temperature that occurs at higher elevation or altitude because of a decrease in air pressure. So those of you that have had chemistry probably remember the ideal gas laws, PV over T, right? PV over T equals, complete the equation, nRT, MRT. So PV over T, that's what's interesting. All right, we're going to decrease our pressure. If pressure decreases, temperature is also going to decrease because it's P over T in that case. Increase pressure, you increase your temperatures. So just as an FYI, if we go up 100 meters in elevation, we're going to get a decrease of about 6.5 degrees Celsius. So more than 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Pretty significant drop. So latitude and altitude kind of go hand in hand. If we increase our latitude, we cause cooling. If we increase our altitude, we cause cooling. All right? But for different reasons. Latitude, it's all about solar radiation. Altitude, it's all about the air pressures and this adiabatic cooling. Now that's just a general trend. We also see variation seasonally. And seasonally it also changes because of the amount of solar radiation that we receive. All right? That amount of solar radiation is affected by our tilt. Tilt and the orbit of the Earth. So our orbit's not a perfect circle around our sun. So our sun's not like right in the middle of our orbit. All right? On one side, the Earth's closer during part of the year than other times of the year. All right, so that's one. The farther we are, the less solar energy we receive. And the other thing is, as we orbit, so our Earth is tilted, as we orbit, it changes what parts of the Earth are exposed to the sun for longer periods of time. All right, we're currently on our path to decreased daylight. It's because we're shifting our orbit. Or the Earth is orbiting, and we're getting to that part where we are. We're going to have shorter day lengths. We're getting less solar radiation. So less time to heat, but we also have less solar radiation, which results in cooler weather for us during the winter and so forth. The poles, the high latitudes, are even more variable because you can go through periods where you don't have any daylight or you have 24 hours day. Does that change our temperatures? Yeah, it does. At the poles, is it going to change it significantly? Depends, how you would define significantly. Because at those points, geez, it's already cold up there. All right, so you've got the effect of the sun affecting our temperature. We also have bodies of water that can affect the temperature, and it does so by modulating the temperature changes or regulating how quickly our temperatures are going to change. This is a more local phenomenon instead of a global phenomenon. So those places near large bodies of water, I'm going to say Nazworthy is not a large body of water. But those places near a large body of water exhibit what's called a maritime climate. So maritime climate is the climate near a large body of water. It is characterized by a narrow range of temperatures. So that water body takes a lot of energy to heat up. It's going to release a lot of energy just to cool down a little bit. All right? if you have a period of warming, right, high solar radiation, the water body isn't going to warm as fast as the land, and as a result, it's going to reduce how much that land actually warms up. So we get more of a moderate type of temperature swing. We don't see a large swing. Go out, I mean, you've seen images of Southern California. That's a classic maritime climate. Our temperature ranges, they're not very much. Hawaii, geez, even more. It's surrounded by an ocean. It's surrounded by an ocean. Classic maritime climate. Unlike us, who exhibit a continental climate. So we're far from any large body of water, so we don't have that regulation or that moderation of temperature, and thus we see large temperature fluctuations. And you've all seen it, you've all experienced it. We can have 75 degrees during the day, and then it gets down to 30 at night. We just had that 88, and then it was like upper 80s last week during the day, but then we had, was that Tuesday or Wednesday morning, where it was like 48 degrees. And a 40-degree temperature swing. That's massive. You don't see that in a maritime climate. Your day and nighttime temperatures, maybe 10-degree difference. Continental climate, not unusual to see 40, 50-degree swings. And we'll see this winter as we continue. So water bodies can modulate our temperature fluctuations. And these figures are in the handouts that are posted. So that's temperature. What about precipitation? Precipitation is affected by the warming and cooling of air masses and their proximity to bodies of water. All right? So we see a lot of rain right near the equator. As long as the air has moisture in it. All right, sun's going to heat up the land. All right, warm air is going to rise. If it has water, all right, that air is going to drop the water as it cools. So warm air rises, it cools. The amount of water the air can hold is temperature dependent. So it can hold a lot more water when it's warm than if it's cool. So through that adiabatic cooling, again, this moist air cools down, drops its water as precipitation. That's why we get a lot of precipitation at the equator. But what we also have to recognize is that air, it drops its water and it's dry. And now it's a cool, dry air. And it has to go someplace. All right, because that air it has mass. Your air particles has mass. So typically, that cool air mass will now return back to the surface around the 30-degree latitude lines. 30-degree north and south. And then as that cool, dry air comes back down, it's going to warm, it's going to pick up moisture, and it's going to dry out the surrounding areas. So that's why a lot of our deserts, or a lot of our major deserts, are located at these 30-degree latitude regions. That process has a name. It's called mid-latitude desertification. Desertification. It's a phenomenon in which cool, dry air returns to the surface, absorbing moisture from the surrounding habitat as it warms and leading to the formation of desert environments. That entire thing explains what happens. Now, what causes the rise and fall? Differences in density. Differences in density of the air based on temperature. Warmer air is less dense, that's why it rises. Cooler air is more dense, that's why it falls. You also get the winds associated with that. So as this warms up and the air warms and leaves and rises, it's going to suck air from the slightly higher latitude to get it replaced. So you kind of get what you see in some books, probably on Wikipedia if you looked it up, you get this circulation of air that happens. So you get dry air coming down here. You also have some air that circulates this way at our higher latitudes. All right. So I think we're going to stop here, and we'll start with the mountain ranges, rain shadows, and so forth on Friday. Don't forget about the quiz. It's posted. Where we're going with this variation is talking about tolerant zones and then predictability. Talk about ways organisms evolve for predictable versus unpredictable environments. All right. Exams, you'll get back on Friday.